Africa was carved up in a room full of men who had never set foot on most of its soil. In the late 19th century, European powers were engaged in a frenzied race, not for progress or enlightenment, but for pure, unbridled profit. They coveted Africa's vast lands, its glittering gold, and even its people. And they wanted it all with a desperate urgency that would reshape the continent forever. So in 1884, 14 European nations gathered in Berlin. They proclaimed to the world that their meeting was about regulating trade and ending disputes. But the truth was far more sinister. This was a gathering to decide who got what, without a single African voice present to object. Across polished mahogany tables, maps of Africa were unfurled. With cold precision, rulers and pens sliced through the continent, creating artificial borders that ignored centuries of tribal lands, thriving kingdoms, and rich cultural histories. Treaties were drafted in languages foreign to those who would be most affected, a cruel irony lost on the men in their starched collars and tailored suits. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Families found themselves suddenly divided by invisible lines. Proud kingdoms were split down the middle. Ancient alliances, forged through generations of trade and intermarriage, were shattered overnight by the stroke of a European pen. But Africa did not remain silent in the face of this brazen theft. From the Zulu warriors in the south to the fierce Ashanti in the west, resistance movements rose up to challenge the audacity of these foreign invaders. Blood was spilled on African soil as people fought to preserve their way of life against the tide of colonialism. The damage, however, was deep and lasting. Even today, border conflicts rage across the continent. Ethnic tensions simmer, often erupting into violence. Economic instability plagues nations whose resources were systematically plundered. All of these modern crises can be traced back to those artificial lines hastily drawn in a faraway European capital. This was not some inevitable fate. It was not the natural course of history. It was a deliberate, calculated plan, conceived, signed, and set into brutal motion in less than 3 months. No vote was cast by those who would bear the consequences. No African voice was heard in those gilded halls. The very soul of Africa was bartered away without its consent, and that is precisely why this story must be told. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 stands as one of history's most egregious acts of theft on a continental scale. It set in motion decades of exploitation, cultural erasure, and human suffering that continue to echo through time. The conference began under the guise of noble intentions. King Leopold II of Belgium, a man whose name would become synonymous with colonial brutality, called for a gathering to discuss freedom of trade in the Congo Basin. European powers already jostling for African territories saw an opportunity to formalize their ambitions. For months leading up to the conference, diplomats and cartographers pored over maps of a continent they had barely explored. They debated the rights to rivers they had never seen, to forests they had never walked through, to peoples whose languages they could not speak. When the delegates finally convened in November 1884, the air was thick with tension and barely concealed greed. Chancellor Otto von Bismarck of Germany, playing host, spoke of bringing the blessings of civilization to Africa. But behind closed doors, the true nature of their civilizing mission became clear. It was about who could claim the biggest slice of the African pie. Day after day, men in frock coats and top hats huddled over maps, arguing over lines of latitude and longitude. They haggled over access to the Niger and Congo rivers, as if discussing the price of cattle at a market. All the while, not a single African representative was present to object, to provide context, or to fight for the rights of their own people. The General Act of the Berlin Conference, signed in February 1885, laid out the rules for this new scramble for Africa. It established the principle of effective occupation. Essentially, if a European power could plant its flag and exert control over a territory, it could claim it as its own. This sparked the mad dash across the continent, with explorers, missionaries, and soldiers racing to claim land for their respective nations. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Ancient kingdoms like Ashanti and Benin found themselves suddenly under British protection. The mighty Zulu nation, which had successfully resisted European encroachment for decades, was finally subdued and divided. The Sokoto Caliphate, a vast Islamic empire in West Africa, was parceled out between Britain and France. Perhaps most infamously, King Leopold II of Belgium was granted personal ownership of the Congo Free State, an area 76 times the size of Belgium itself. What followed was one of the most brutal regimes in colonial history, with millions of Congolese dying from forced labor, disease, and outright murder in the pursuit of rubber and ivory. The Berlin Conference redrew Africa's map with no regard for ethnic, linguistic, or cultural boundaries. The straight lines that now define many African borders are a testament to this callous disregard. The Maasai people found themselves split between British Kenya and German Tanganyika. The EU were divided between German Togoland, British Gold Coast, and French Dahomey. These arbitrary divisions sowed the seeds for countless future conflicts. When African nations finally gained independence in the mid-20th century, they inherited borders that made little sense. Grouping rival ethnic groups together or separating communities that had always been united. The economic impact was equally devastating. The conference established a system of resource extraction that would drain Africa of its wealth for generations. Valuable minerals, cash crops, and human labor were funneled to European capitals, leaving African economies crippled and dependent. But Africa did not accept this fate lying down. Resistance movements sprang up across the continent. The Maji-Maji Rebellion in German East Africa. The Herero and Nama uprisings against German rule in Southwest Africa. The fierce resistance of Samori Toure against French expansion in West Africa. These were just a few of the many attempts by Africans to reclaim their stolen lands and preserve their ways of life. Yet the damage had been done. The Berlin Conference set in motion a chain of events that would reshape Africa's destiny for centuries to come. Its effects are still felt today in ongoing border disputes, in economic inequalities, and in the very fabric of African society struggling to reconcile pre-colonial identities with arbitrary colonial boundaries. The story of the Berlin Conference is a stark reminder of the power of maps, of borders, and of the arrogance of those who believe they can reshape the world from afar. It is a tale of greed masked as progress, of theft disguised as civilization. This was not fate. It was not destiny. It was a deliberate plan, conceived, executed, and enforced in less than 3 months. No vote. No voice. No Africa. And that is exactly why this story must be told. We must uncover the truths they worked so hard to hide. We must understand how decisions made in distant European capitals continue to shape the lives of millions across Africa. Only by confronting this dark chapter of history can we hope to build a more just and equitable future. The borders drawn in Berlin in 1884 still bleed today. It's time we rewrite this history, not to erase it, but to ensure its lessons are never forgotten.